I saved the aesthetic aspect of writing kind of for last as far as my videos and stuff go. And when I'm teaching a first year composition course or first year writing course, the aesthetic aspect of writing, it has a special place in first year writing because there are creative writing classes, there are literature classes. So I have another video that talks about how to do the aesthetic aspect of writing in an academic essay, and talks about fancy title, fun or fancy titles, using introductions or hooks, visual design and stylized language, or a little bit more powerful language and that sort of thing. But the aesthetic aspect of writing generally is one of the 8 aspects of writing, and we need to be aware of it not just in creative writing or literature, but in all types of writing. It still plays a role. It's just understanding how it applies, just like any of the other aspects. Each of them apply differently. And so first, the definition of aesthetics, so that we understand what this is. In philosophy, aesthetics is a set of principles concerned with the nature and appreciation of beauty, especially in art. And so this is beauty, and the beauty side of it, the full spectrum, beauty to ugly, everything in the middle. What makes things more beautiful or more interesting or more fun, and the opposite. And so it's a full spectrum. But and so when we discuss this in writing, it links to more common major emphases of reflective writing, emotive writing, because it has to do often with this felt sense or emotive thing, but it's often more seen as literature and creative writing, because there are specific value sets to these to aesthetics. When that is the primary thing that you are focused on, you write differently than if you. It's a different emphasis, a different rhetorical purpose, but it is very much just as much connected to all the other all the other aspects of writing. It's just got this special role because in the history of writing over in the U.S. or in Western society over the last 150 years, literature, creative writing, and rhetoric kind of have this a little bit of tension in the disciplines. So we want to be aware of how they all fit together. To call something creative writing often means people are thinking either creative nonfiction, but more likely creative fiction, and stories that are meant to be art, or stories that are meant to be present some sort of truth through fictional characters and that kind of thing. And so it's all the stuff you see on Netflix that aren't documentaries. All the Marvel things, all those things dealing with story. We'll talk more about the components, but even with that, other types of writing, all kinds of writing, require some sort of creativity to them, and we don't want people to think they're necessarily boring, even if the aesthetics are not the primary value. If in a lot of academic writing, the primary value is scientific. So I feel like I have to get through these basic things before we can really dig in and appreciate what the aesthetic aspect of writing does. So aesthetics deals with beauty and artistic nature. In writing, it connects to reflective or emotive writing, literature, and creative writing. That's where most people hear the principles that we're going to cover here. So as we look, when we're in writing and thinking about aesthetic values of writing, we're looking at when is writing interesting, fun, boring, exciting, dull, plain, entertaining, or bland. When we are writing, when our writing triggers emotional responses. This links to pathos. It's an emotional sense to writing. That's an aesthetic value. It's not necessarily wrong, but it does have to be used carefully so that it's not manipulative, which is why people struggle with it in rhetorical context. And so and it's one of those appeals. So emotional writing can be very powerful. We just have to use it wisely, responsibly. But aesthetic values also link to experiencing something. When we write with aesthetics in mind, we want people to sense or experience something new or different. And so we'll often connect with sensory perception through the words or language or visual design. We'll hit on the 5 senses. We'll try and make the words get people to hear, smell, taste, touch, or see something vividly in words or in whatever the writing allows us to. So we want to be aware of that, whatever writing medium we're using. And because it's dealing with things that are fun or exciting or entertaining, or the aesthetic values of writing are linked to emotion, linked to vivid word choice, and kind of values of experiencing something or entertaining someone or expressing kind of self-expression and reflective writing because of that emotive sense. So those are the values. So let's talk kind of more in a structured way. Key components of the aesthetic aspect of writing. I've got the 4 E's of the aesthetic aspect. I've already mentioned them: emotion, experience, expression, entertainment, or entertaining, or to entertain. And so those are the 4 E's of the aesthetic. Those are key. These are things embedded in what it means to deal with beauty or do creative writing or have this value in your writing, whatever genre you're writing in. And so we've got that as so. Then the first step, one of the cool things that came out of research in the 1980s was, and maybe into the 90s a little more, was the way that reflective writing and emotional writing was a form of kind of psychotherapy, or people could write through traumatic experiences and get to a place where they were healing psychologically and emotionally because they were able to process through the things that happened to them in a healthy way. And so it's kind of the same thing when you go and sit. It's very similar to when you're sitting in that, you see people in movies on the couch in the therapist's office and they're just talking everything out, that verbal processing. Well, reflective writing is very much like that, and it can be a way to heal. Sometimes writing a fictional story and letting your characters work through the emotions you're trying to deal with can actually, even if you never share that with anyone, can be very helpful in healing. Sometimes hearing stories that we can relate to of other people going through things and us relating to them can cause us to heal. It's one of the most powerful things about fiction and writing, and we'll talk more about mythos and the power of story in another video. I've talked about visual design in other places. When it's aesthetic, it's about looking pretty, drawing attention, creating an experience, and it can even emphasize art for art's sake. So we can embed pictures that combine with words to give us an emotive response, not necessarily to provide information like an infographic or anything like that. Sometimes we use visual design just because this will be fun. We use colors because this will be interesting or this will cause an emotional reaction. That's okay. We want to distinguish that intention from technologically used visual design, rhetorically used visual design, and I've talked about that in other places. The last 2 things I'm going to talk about real quick, because we're going to drill down into them in other videos over time, and this may end up feeling almost like a creative writing or literary analysis class series of videos, because I'm not, but with story usually is where we get that key tie to literature and creative writing. When we write stories of fictional or real people, and we make them experiential, and we use them as a way to relate to the world or understand something about the world we wouldn't if that story didn't exist. Maybe we take a psychology class and we're learning all about all these different personality types, egocentrism, and all that, and it's only kind of going in intellectually, but then we read a story or we watch Iron Man and suddenly we realize what egocentrism is, or being egotistical, or whatever it is, in his character. We see at the beginning Robert Downey Jr. Tony Stark being this very self-focused guy. That can be an experiential thing that ties to that intellectual consideration and reinforces it. So there are some people who learn lots from stories, and so it can be a really meaningful type of data. That's why even in creative nonfiction and biographies and memoirs can be so powerful, because you're learning from someone's lived experience, and maybe you don't have someone to share those kinds of stories in your life, or maybe you do. Maybe you need to go and ask people what their story is. Go find someone who's 10 or 15 years older than you and ask them what's something that they remember, and just let them tell their story and experience it with them. There's a power to that, and so with story, I'll talk about it more later, but there's this mythos, which is usually connected to myths and other powerful stories, the hero's journey, that kind of thing. We'll talk about it later. And then there's also, it can be tied with veritas. So when a story is powerful, because it causes experiential or emotive lessons to be learned, that's good. When it's linked to a true life story, it has even more power because it's not something I made up for fun or for art or to try and get someone to realize something. It's a real story that also teaches those things. And so what we'll see when we get there is that some of the most powerful stories are the ones that have that don't just have little T truths but big T truths connected to them. Finally, and what is most commonly associated with the aesthetic aspect of writing connected to literature is this the idea of poetics or stylistics. When we talk about an author's style and or wordplay, metaphor, metonymy, rhyme, when we talk about all of those things, all the different ways that we can make language fun or pop, onomatopoeia, that kind of stuff, that is a key component because it connects to those senses, the five senses we have, and lets that experiential nature come over it. And come through the language. So I have some books that have 30, 40 pages of stylistic devices and poetic devices. I give my class a 9-page one that's a little more digestible. But there is a lot in that, and cooler people than me study it, take their whole lives to study it. But this isn't the introduction to the aesthetic aspect of writing. It is meant to draw readers in. It's meant to be the part of you that thinks about whether your writing's interesting, experiential, emotionally engaging, entertaining. And so there are some genres where that rhetorical purpose, the dial's turned way up on, and then others where we have to be really careful and really subtle in how we and look for all the little possible nuances to really crank up the entertainment value without detracting from the knowledge we're trying to get across and that sort of thing. And so we'll talk more about the aesthetic aspect of writing in future videos, but this is the brief overview. Brief.